Connor Old, and welcome back to another episode of More Than Kurosawa. And this week we're going to be looking at our very first Vietnamese film, When the 10th Month Comes, from one of the most renowned Vietnamese directors of all time. And the movie we're covering today is a real historical kind of a moment for Vietnamese film, but is also kind of a secret lost masterpiece that I think not a lot of people talk about in that high of esteem, but is definitely worth your time. All that and more coming up into this episode, but if you are new to the series, welcome. If you're coming back again, thank you for joining us once again for another episode here of More Than Kurosawa. If you don't know, though, what we do every single week is talk about a different Asian movie by a different Asian director to try and help us understand and have a better a picture of the wide world of Asian cinema. There are great Asian directors out there, more than Akira Kurosawa or Bong Joon-ho, or maybe some of the more popular, well-known directors. That's the point of this series, is to highlight a new great director every single week and one of their best movies. And usually they are utilized to be a good starting point. So I think for a lot of people, you may not have heard of Đặng Nhật Minh, but you should definitely check out this movie if you haven't seen any of his movies and you want a little bit of an understanding of what Vietnamese film has brought and their place in movie history. But what we like to do is split the video up into two parts. The first part is discussing why I want to cover Đặng Nhật Minh and his importance within Asian movie history, and then the second half of the video is a discussion of the film, what makes it interesting, what are the themes that the director of the week is interested in, how does that apply to the movie. In this case, we're going to be talking about kind of his probably most famous movie, and I think his best movie, When the 10th Month Comes, which we don't always pick the most famous movie, but in this case, I think it was appropriate. But jumping into things, starting off now with why I wanted to cover Đặng Nhật Minh. I mentioned it there at the top, but this is our first Vietnamese film. And now that we've got kind of a month left with the series, I thought it would be useful and kind of helpful to look at other types of countries and some of their films. We've covered a lot of Japanese directors, covered Korean directors, Bhutanese, Chinese, Filipino directors. Now I wanted to cover, a Vietnamese director. And the reason why we haven't covered one in the past is mostly because there hasn't really been a strong movie industry in Vietnam, and still really totally is. I mean, when you're talking about 20th century Vietnam, it lines up interestingly with kind of the popularization of movies. Movies start to get really popular kind of in the 20s, 30s. But then when you look at a country like Vietnam, a lot of their 20th century is kind of marred by upheaval, by war, whether it be the French in the 40s and 50s, and then the Americans in the 60s and 70s, and then the Cambodians in the 80s. There, wasn't really seemingly maybe resources to support a new burgeoning industry in the case of movies. But Đặng Nhật Minh really kind of post the American kind of Vietnam War in the 80s, made some documentaries in the 60s, but in the 80s started to really get some international acclaim and put Vietnamese cinema on the map. The series is called More Than Kurosawa, but you would also almost kind of link Min to a Kurosawa or Mizoguchi, where those two Japanese filmmakers really helped put Japanese films on the map in the 50s. But for the Vietnamese industry, it took a little bit longer there, all the way until the 80s. And then in terms of people in the West actually seeing the movie, it's not until, almost the late 90s. So it is still, I mentioned at the top of the video, I think an underseen movie. His movies are relatively difficult to find. Actually, they're relatively easy to find in that a lot of them are on YouTube, but the transfers aren't always great. The quality isn't that great. They're really difficult even if you want to buy them or to rent them. Difficult to find that way. So there is limitations to that. But I still recommend you, if you have a chance to check out one of his movies, do so, because I haven't seen all of his movies, but the ones that I did check out, I thought were really interesting, really sort of beautifully crafted. And I think him as a filmmaker, what he brings and what his power is his perspective. Because myself personally, I think a lot of people may not be super well versed in Vietnamese movies because there just aren't that many. I think a lot of people's relationship to Vietnam is through Vietnam War movies. So you've seen the Hollywood movies like Apocalypse Now or Platoon or Born on the 4th of July, movies that I all like, but distinctly from an American perspective. I think that the power of Đặng Nhật Minh is how lovingly he captures the landscapes of Vietnam, the people of Vietnam, and he reminds me in a way of a filmmaker like Choning Dorji, who we covered already on this series, who is a Bhutanese filmmaker, and Bhutan doesn't really have a history of movies either, and he kind of helped introduce that to the world, and he had the benefit of no one ever really shooting in Bhutan, and he was doing it. He was showing the landscape and sharing the culture, and there's a sense of kind of perspective that he has that was really powerful. I think similarly here with Minh, who has the power of being one of the first Vietnamese directors on an international scale to make something that's really great, but also, I think, help people get a better understanding of the people of Vietnam, the landscapes. He's also what I would describe as a sensory filmmaker. He's great at understanding place and atmosphere because he's one of the first Vietnamese directors to shoot in Vietnam from that perspective. But I also think some of his filmmaking techniques add to that. He loves a wide shot where you can see the landscape of the kind of countryside there in Vietnam. He'll often have these kinds of scenes of people walking up hills or riding bikes or going through the fields, some of the more manual labor that's just a way of life in these villages. Oftentimes in a lot of his movies, because they're set in these kind of countryside villages, you have a lot of people who know each other, so there's a small town vibe, and there's kind of a beauty in the interconnectivity of it that I think adds to the drama of his movies, because everyone kind of knows everyone and everyone's somewhat connected. So technically he loves a long take, which I think helps build place and atmosphere and help us understand where we are and add in some of those smaller details. So he'll pan the camera, but always kind of keeping in this kind of longer take, not a lot of editing necessarily. In a way, some of his 80s movies feel like very heavily inspired by like 50s and 60s movies. So they're not inspired necessarily by the 70s Hollywood New Wave. In many ways, when the 10th month comes, shot in black and white, feels like a movie that came from the 40s. It feels closer to a Kurosawa film or a Mizoguchi film than it does, let's say, Ferris Bueller's Day Off. Also, his stories are very people-centric. I mentioned that kind of tight-knit community, so I think he's interested in the drama and the romance and the life and death of the kind of tension between all the different characters within the story. But speaking about maybe more of his themes, I think a lot of them show up here in the movie we're covering today. So just starting off about now with the discussion of the film, this movie we're covering today, When the 10th Month Comes, 1984, about a wife who is coming back to her village after just coming from the city to find out more about her husband, why her husband has not been sending any more letters. She finds out that her husband passed away a year ago and nobody told her. But upon arriving to the village, she doesn't reveal that information to her father-in-law in fear that maybe that information will kill him because he's kind of near death. He's an old man, and she doesn't want to kind of bring upon that bad news. But of course, the tension of the movie then becomes, we know that her husband's dead, but she has to kind of keep up this lie. So then she contacts and kind of links up with a local teacher in the area, a man who starts writing letters in the style of her dead husband to kind of keep joy and a little bit of hope alive within the community, and the kind of struggles that go on, and the inevitability of what we know is going to happen, which is people are going to find out, but we're trying to watch and figure out, and we're entertained by the fact of her trying to navigate this scenario and see how long she can keep it up with, and then some of the complex romances that lead to it and whatnot. Really interesting kind of premise and setup, and one that worked really well for the drama that the movie's trying to convey. It's a premise that reminded me a lot of Pedro Almodovar films or Asghar Farhadi films, where they're kind of these tense dramas about interpersonal relationships. So it's not the end of the world literally, like there's an alien invasion, but it is the end of the world for these characters. If you've seen an Almodovar film or a Farhadi film, there is a similarity too in just the genius of the premise, and knowing that there's going to be some awkward conversations or intense kind of personal relationships that bond with that. There's also, I think, a power to two people coming together to collaborate on a secret, and the kind of bond that they're able to build there, and some of that romance. And so I think Đặng Nhật Minh is skilled at the drama aspect of that, of actually creating tension in a interpersonal kind of a way. I think that it's also a movie that is as inspired by, or not inspired by, but is almost kind of similar to an Almodovar film as it is a Shakespeare play. There's a scene with a kind of a spirit or a ghost of her late husband that we have an interaction with. It reminded me a lot of something like Hamlet, and the scene, of course, the very famous scene in that play. There is a kind of semi-fantastical element to it, of a traditional drama that reminded me a bit of Shakespeare, also in the sense of just the big stakes within people. Now in Shakespeare, it's usually lots of kings and royalty, so there are kind of other people and other impacts that are made, but the kind of mother-father romance kind of tension and balance, I think, is also kind of indebted in this movie. And then at the center of the movie, you have this incredible tour de force performance by Van Lee. I think this is a movie that relies on its star a lot, and she brings a lot to an already great character, because I've mentioned this in the past, but it's easy to say, write on a piece of paper, a character is saying one thing but feeling something else. Because, of course, it's then the actor's responsibility to, through her face in this case, express in her case the kind of grief that she's feeling that she can't show because she's keeping up this lie, the fact of the shame that she has because she doesn't really have the courage to tell the truth, some of the guilt that she feels because of that. And oftentimes in these scenes, there's this kind of double speak in which we, as an audience member, recognize that she's feeling that grief because we have that piece of information that her husband's dead. But then, of course, she can't kind of convey that to some of the other characters who don't have that piece of information. And like I said, it's very easy to write that. It's another thing to have an actor convey that and convey these complex themes, grief and shame, but then also, love, and also wanting to have her husband back, but then also maybe developing romantic feelings for this male teacher because he's representing her husband. And there's lots of kind of complex psychological themes going on here. But those complex themes are conveyed to us easily and understandably through the acting, through the kind of facial, movements that she is conveying to us as an audience member, that if you're an empathetic person or engaging with the story, you can pick up on the kind of struggle, that internal struggle that she has. Some of the best actors I will always like to think of are people who can make thinking exciting, you can read their face and realize that they've put something together, or they're thinking, or that they're feeling something that they're not showing. That's a hard thing to do. That's what makes, I think, a lot of actors special. And Van Lee here really embodies that as this kind of really tightly wound person who wants to explode with all these kinds of emotions, but is keeping it hidden and trying to navigate all these interpersonal relationships and the complex feelings that she has throughout the movie. Really just well done drama, engaging, tense, beautiful acting, I think. Also, I mentioned in terms of just the perspective of these Vietnamese people during a time of war, not during the American Vietnam War, more so kind of in that, I think it's the Cambodian border war with Vietnam in this time period in the 80s. But of course, I think still very indicative of Vietnam as a country, just because most of its 20th century you think of it as a time of upheaval, as a time of war, that it's intensely part of that culture. So to have a story that's kind of connected to that and about the kind of casualties of that war in a more of a familiar interpersonal aspect, I think was definitely done here by Đặng Nhật Minh. And to get a great performance out of someone like Van Lee, really remarkable. Was one of the best kind of performances I've seen in a long time. So for an amazing performance, for kind of a complex drama that has a combination of Almodovar films, but also Shakespeare, I think you should definitely check out this movie. Once again, another interesting example that when it comes to Asian cinema, there is more than Kurosawa. But that's about it, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. Make sure you comment below. Let me know if you've seen this movie, if you are interested in checking it out. There is, I don't know if it's illegal right now, but it is, something on YouTube with this movie, so it is something that you may want to check out. It does come highly recommended, but don't think of it as an 80s movie and compare it to kind of Blade Runner or something like that. It is much more closer, I think, to in pace and tone to a Kurosawa movie from the 50s or a Mizoguchi movie from the 50s, but still dramatically rich and an interesting text. But that's about it. Until next time, stay tuned.